My name is Becky Wallen. I am the Field to Fork Coordinator for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. I have been deer hunting since I was 11. It's something I love, something I'm passionate about, something I'm passionate about teaching about, and super excited to host these webinar series. Unfortunately, we're not in person doing the normal Field to Fork workshops, but hopefully we can provide some super sweet, comprehensive information through these webinar series. And if you have any follow-up questions after the webinar, just give me an email and I will throw that in the chat box, or you should all have it. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jason. Jason Scannell is our guest speaker tonight. He's been a deer hunter for 35 years, and he has experience hunting deer in multiple states. He is a hunter education instructor and has been helping with the Field to Fork program since 2018. So, yeah. Jason, if you want to go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Becky. I didn't realize that we started hunting at the same age. I started deer hunting when I was 11 also, but I think I got you on years. But what I want to talk to you all today about is the title is Basic Deer Ecology in the Hunter. And pretty much what that is just how deer interact with their environment, how they deal with their food resources, cover, the things that they need from it, and how they go about acquiring it and how it changes through the seasons. And, you know, just to start off, I just want to go over with a few basics with white-tailed deer. And anytime I say deer today, I'm just referring to the white-tailed deer. We're not going to get involved with any other species of deer, just white-tailed deer. And a lot of this you all will probably already know at the first, but I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page right from the very beginning. The first thing is just a little bit of the history. The white-tailed deer is indigenous to Kentucky. It's a native species. The earliest written description that we have was around 1750, and it just said that deer are plentiful. But that's not always been the case. By 1900, they had been severely depleted by market hunting. And as a result of that market hunting, in the entire United States, there is approximately 300 to 500,000 deer left. Fortunately, through conservation efforts, game commissions were established, such as the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. And they're tasked with managing these resources. And so, you know, currently, because of these efforts, there's almost 1 million deer in Kentucky. So if you contrast that with the amount of deer that were left in 1900 in the entire country, there's over twice as many, or nearly twice as many as there are in Kentucky as opposed to the entire country. Just a little bit about the basic biology of whitetails. They are what's called crepuscular, and that's just a fancy term that says they like to feed right when the sun's coming up and right when the sun's going down. That's when they're the most active. Now, they also move around and they eat in the daytime or in the nighttime, but those twilight areas are their really active times. And, you know, to go over just a few more of the simple terms, you know, bucks are obviously male deer. They have an antler that is bone. They shed that every year. They regrow it, and it's covered in velvet at first. And then through the course of the summer, it hardens, and in September, that velvet is shed. Now, the doe or the females, they don't have antlers. They are not nearly as they're a lot more of a consistency or a consistent behavior-wise as opposed to bucks. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But then you also have the fawns or the yearlings. And for the most part, you usually hear most people just say a fawn. Occasionally you'll hear button buck, which is a first-year buck. They're born in June, sometimes as early or April to June. They're actually born scent-free. And that is a strategy that deer use. And the main reason I'm mentioning that is if you see a fawn early in that time period, leave it alone, because its mother will wander off. And because it's scent-free, that fawn is just going to lay there and try to hide. Don't bother them. Deer as a whole are capable of living up to 20 years, but that is incredibly rare in the wild. It's unusual for a deer to live in the wild 10 years. In Kentucky, most of them in the more populated counties live around 3 years. Some of the least popular, in the lesser populated counties, they can live for longer, more commonly. But when you're factoring that in, also remember you're including fawn mortality in that. And so, it really hurts the overall age when you're having something that's 2 weeks old dying, and compared to something that's a year, 2, 3 years old. As far as the mortality of deer, there's a few major factors in Kentucky. The first is diseases, and the one that you hear the most about is EHD. You also will hear it called blue tongue. And it's a virus that's spread by biting flies. Drought conditions hasten the spread of it. It's they like to breed in mud. And when you have a drought condition, those deer become concentrated to get to water. And so it's able to move around that midge, that biting fly is able to get to more deer and spread that disease more effectively. But that is not usually an every year thing. You'll see occasional outbreaks every 4 to 8 years in different parts of the state. The second one I want to talk just briefly about is CWD. CWD is chronic wasting disease. It has not been detected in Kentucky, but it is a big player nationally with deer. And the main reason I bring it up is because make sure you check your hunting guides, and there's different transportation laws that deal with deer carcasses and meat because of CWD. And just check your hunting guides to make sure that you're up to date on those laws. Another significant cause of mortality, obviously, is predators. Now, when we think of predators, we usually think of, a bear or coyote, bobcats. All of those are predators for deer. But the main predator for deer in Kentucky is humans. First off, hunters, which I'm assuming since y'all are signed up for this class, you're hoping to do. And then also vehicle collisions, cars. That is a major cause of mortality for deer. And then indirectly through habitat loss. Deer also injure themselves, fighting for dominance. You won't see it so much here in Kentucky, but if you go to the northern states, you can get a fairly high winter kill where deer just cannot get enough food in order to survive the winter. But that's not a problem here. We had a lot more abundant food and a fairly mild climate. So winter kill is not a major factor here. Now, I kind of covered, the things that cause deer mortality. So now we're moving into how we're getting more deer. The reproduction of them. The breeding season for deer is called the rut. And if you're hanging around hunters at any point in time, at some point, you're going to hear them talk about the rut. Well, the rut is, it is their actual breeding season. And it begins in late October, and its maximum peak is usually right there in mid-November. It varies by a few days, depending on what area of the state you're in, and depending upon the year, it might shift a couple, 3 days one way or the other. But that mid-November period is consistently the peak of the rut. At that time, does enter estrus, which means they're ready to breed, and bucks, their testosterone level has been steadily increasing through the fall, and it maxes out at that period. And it causes them to become very territorial, dominant, trying to exert dominance over each other. Now, one thing I mentioned November, if a doe goes unbred in November, she will most likely, if she's capable of it, come into estrus again in December. So November is the peak, but occasionally there is a secondary rut in December. Now, one thing I do, let me bring this up. Hopefully I get this right. The deer themselves are far from defenseless in terms of their senses. So if we looked at these deer, and some of you I know don't have, some of y'all are audio only, but they have excellent senses of smell. They can see, or I'm sorry, they can smell about 60 times better than we can. They are very good at upwind, if the threat is upwind, and being able to detect it. Their eyes are very much on the sides as opposed to the front of their head. This gives them 310-degree vision. They're not optimized like we are for for tracking moving objects or being able to hit something. They just are designed to detect motion and then decide if it's a threat or not. And they do that with their eyes, with their nose, and then also their ears. If you look at these pictures, you can see their ears are in all different sorts of configurations. Well, those ears articulate, and they move around, and they're used to pinpoint specific sounds. And then you'll also see this one deer here has its leg raised. That is because it's stomping. And they will, when they're alarmed, they will kind of do a little bit of a stomp and stomp. And then that tail comes up if they're really threatened. And when the tail comes up, they're not usually sticking around. And they can get out of there quick. They can run nearly 30 miles an hour and jump up to 8 feet high. This is the whitetail I was talking about, and anybody that's seen deer and scared them, you can almost guarantee that whitetail comes up when they're running away. They have some vocalizations as well that will that they can use to express alarm. And I'm horrible at doing it, but it's essentially what's called a snort, and it kind of just a type sound. When you hear that, it's pretty much over. They're alerted. They know you're there. That's kind of the basics of some of what we need to know about deer biology. Now I kind of want to move into what deer want to get out of their habitat. So, you have 3 essential things that they need from their habitat: food, water, and cover. And we'll look at the food item first. Deer are a browser. And what I mean by a browser is they eat a lot of different plants, and they don't really eat a whole lot of grasses. It's more broadleaf plants. what's called a forb, essentially what most people think of as a wildflower. Deer like a lot of wildflowers. They also will eat on the leaves and the stems off of woody plants, shrubs and trees. They will eat some grasses, mostly when they're young, soft and tender. But the big thing, and especially in the fall, is mast. And what we're referring to as mast is fruits and nuts and seeds. And we're on soft mast. And so what that is fruits. The thing about fruits is deer love fruit. The bad thing about fruits is they don't last very long. If you go and buy an apple at the store, you have to eat it pretty quick. You can't just let it sit there and sit there and sit there. Soft mass is a valuable commodity for deer eating, but it's not something that they're going to be able to hold on to for a long time and as a bank. What is a food bank for them is hard mast. With hard mast, you have your acorns, which is a big component of deer's diet and is very important for them putting on fat in the winter and in the fall and into the winter. Then you also have beech nuts and hickory nuts, which do play a role, but they're not nearly as preferred as the acorns. And Fish and Wildlife actually puts out a survey of mast. This one's a little bit more friendly, but it shows the level of how successful mast is every year in the state as a whole. And this isn't the full mast report. This is just a kind of a summary graphic that they actually just put out, I believe, yesterday. You have your white oak and your red oak and your hickory and your beech, but the main ones are these two right here that you want to pay attention to, because when these are good years, deer don't need to move as much because they really key on these two, red oak and white oak. You can actually see a correlation of deer harvest numbers. When there's good mast years, deer harvest numbers aren't as high as when there's bad mast years. It's not a huge difference, but there is a difference with them. And then also with mast, especially with white oaks, this is the essentially showing right here how you have a good year, a bad year, a good year, a bad year with white oaks. Now, if we go over here to red oaks, you have a serious drop one year where there was probably a freeze that killed out a lot of the flowers, and so we didn't have good production that year. But red oaks are very consistent. They are very important in terms of being that food bank for deer. We need to talk about water now. And in the spring and the summer, when there's lots of green foliage, water, they get a lot of it from what they're eating. It's not, they'll still get drinks from everywhere, from puddles or from creeks or lakes, but they obtain a lot of water from that foliage that they're eating. But as it dries out through the course of the year, and especially in a drought, it becomes a lot more of a commodity. And so if you're in drought conditions and you have good water in the area that you're hunting, that can be a potential place to, consider for setting up. Because if everything's dry, then they need to get that water, and they will travel to get that water. I did mention a little bit earlier about EHD and how drought can play a role in that, but that's just part of it. EHD is something that we're not going to be able to get rid of, and it's just something that we have to deal with occasionally. The other factor with the environment is cover. You have bedding, obviously, where they can hide, provides protection from predators, but it also provides some environmental factors. When it's really hot outside, if you bed in the shade, it's going to be cooler. If it's really cold outside and they can get on the south side of a hill and they're out of the wind, especially when it's sunny out, that can make it a lot easier because, they're not like us. They don't have that house that they can go into in the winter. They're out there 24/7, 365. And so whatever that weather condition is, they're dealing with it from the time they're born until they die. Now, all these factors come together to play into the size of the range that particular deer will inhabit. Now, if you are missing or these three items are widely dispersed in an area, that range becomes larger. If you have all of it in abundance, then they're going to be staying in a tighter area. Usually in Kentucky, a deer will have a home range of about a square mile, roughly. This also kind of, leads into, I've talked about habitat and everything. What is deer habitat? To answer, it's a lot of things. They're very adaptable. They are the most widely distributed mammal in North America. That if you look at a picture of the area that they cover, it's almost the entire United States. Some of those mountains and some extreme deserts they're not in, but they do good in the woods. They do good in grasslands. They do good in croplands. Everything they're able to adapt. You'll find them in subdivisions. But you can get a rough idea of deer densities if you look at the zone map for deer hunting that Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife puts out. And so zone 1, the green areas, these are the most populated areas. Zone 2, not quite as populated, but they still have a lot of deer. Zone 3 and Zone 4 are areas that it's very restrictive limits. And if you look at this area, for the most part, one, you're in a more mountainous area of the state, but then it also encompasses a lot of Daniel Boone National Forest. And a lot of that is old growth, mature forest. Not necessarily old growth, but mature forest that lacks understory. And that is the one area that deer, they will inhabit it, but it doesn't have as much available food for them. They don't have that low browse. And so that's part of the reason why you see so much of this Zone 3 and Zone 4 in that part of the state. One thing I do want to mention that isn't really part of habitat but can influence habitat is baiting. Baiting, when you bait for deer, it's only legal on private lands. It's illegal on public lands in Kentucky. But what it can do is artificially inflate deer numbers in the area with respect to the actual habitat. So if you have a habitat that isn't, quite as good as what it is, and you're baiting, it will draw deer in. But it then is using those resources in the habitat because the deer aren't just going to eat the bait. They're going to eat other things. And so when you stop that baiting, it's going to cause those deer to relocate to a new area. So you can actually end up dispersing deer by, if you bait and then stop. And what I want to do now is kind of combine the biology and the habitat and throw that in with how things change through the seasons. And I want to have kind of an emphasis on the hunting aspect of it. I'm going to mention a little bit with the preseason. If we're looking at July, August, before the season starts, those deer are primarily feeding on those soft herbaceous plants. Those wildflowers we were talking about, the woody plant leaves, soft mass, and they're going to have a very thin summer coat. They're dealing with the heat at that time. You've got the long days. They're coming out in the fields in twilight and early morning. For the most part, they're usually okay with water unless there's a drought. And if there's a drought, that kind of going to change things because that water is going to become the limiting factor. But the bucks at that particular time are doing something that they don't really do a whole lot during the rest of the hunting season. Or, well, we're not in the hunting season yet, but they don't really do a lot in the hunting season. And they're going to form what's called a bachelor group. So you're going to have bucks of a bunch of different age classes. You might have 1.5-year-old deer with a 3.5-year-old deer and a couple 5-year-old deer, and they're going to stay together in a herd. And they're going to travel together. And the does will also, but they're not going to, they'll usually be separated in their own groups. Both of these, and they'll be with their fawns off at the time. Both of these groups will be patternable. And what I mean by that is they are going to consistently be going to the same available food sources. Unless something pushes them off of that food source, you're going to see them out there every evening or in that same field in the morning. Now, if that food source becomes exhausted, obviously they're going to move. Or if a better one opens up, they might move. But they are consistent. And then, you're getting into your early season of deer hunting, which first Saturday in September every year, that's the start of bow season. You're still in this pattern for the most part. It's changing a little bit. You're getting a little bit drier at that time of year. You're, September, October, that's your driest part of the year. But what does kind of change things in respect to that early part of the season is with bucks when they start losing their velvet. When those antlers have hardened and that velvet is starting to come off, it will influence their behavior. They start to break up out of those bachelor groups. Maybe not, they just don't scatter. But where you had a bachelor group of 6, maybe it becomes, 2 groups of 2 and 2 single deer. They just aren't in that tight herd as much as they were before. Does, they're still pretty much same old on that same pattern, especially early on it. But what you're going to start seeing is they might be coming out where you see them at the same time every day, but those days are getting shorter and shorter. So you're getting less available chances to hunt them at that time of year. And so, that first early part of our archery season, they're very, very patternable, but it's almost kind of a ticking clock because your clock is getting shorter or your daylight's getting shorter. And then the other thing that's getting ready to happen is that mast is starting to come in. And when that hard mast falls, that changes a lot. Late September, mid-late September into October is when you start seeing those acorns start falling off the tree. And that changes everything in terms of deer movement and behavior. If you are around deer hunters, at some point you will hear the term October lull. And what they mean by that term is they're not seeing many deer where they were seeing deer, and so they must not be moving. Well, in actuality, they are moving. Studies have shown that they're moving more. It's just that they're moving to different places. Now they're going into the forest. They're getting those acorns. They're moving from from tree to tree where those acorns are dropping. And at this time period, if you can be a little bit of a forester and identify acorns in the white oak group, then that's probably going to be a really good place to hunt. Because, your two main acorns, your white oak and your red oaks, and I'm not necessarily talking about those particular species so much as a white oak group and a red oak group. And the difference between those is white oaks only are on the tree for one season. So in the spring, they flower, they pollinate, that's fall, they drop off. Red oaks, they pollinate, they last through the rest of the year. They go through that into that summer, and then the next fall, they fall off the tree. And they're going to have more of a chemical called tannin that makes them taste different, makes them a little more bitter, does some other chemical things as well. That makes them a little less preferred, but they're actually extremely important for deer as well, because they're essentially the money in the bank for deer. Those white oaks will actually germinate that year. So if they don't get eaten, they're germinating that season. The red oaks don't germinate until spring. And so they can persist on the forest floor through the winter to where that they're edible and capable of being eaten. Also, at this time, that late September, early October into mid-October, all those herbaceous plants that we were talking about earlier, the wildflowers and everything, they're starting to dry up. Crops are being harvested. Soybeans have turned yellow. They're being harvested. Corn is being harvested. Everything has changed on that level. Leaves are falling off the trees. There's a lot of change going on. Those bucks, the bachelor groups are breaking up. They're starting to become more aggressive towards each other. The testosterone is starting to ramp up in their body even more. And so they're sparring, they're rubbing on trees. They are, let me see if I do this correctly. Yes. Over here, you can see them rubbing. They do that to help mark territory. And then they also begin to make a scrape. And what scrapes are I'm not really familiar with the apps, but I've heard that there's this thing called tinder. Well, a scrape is deer tinder. It is, except it's the chemical version of it. They smell each other on it. And it is what they use to know what deer are in the area. They learn what bucks are in the area and what does are in the area because they will urinate in these scrapes. And this is actually a picture of a scrape that I took it was Sunday. And you can see they've already started to make scrapes this early into October. It's not definitely isn't a breeding time or anything like that, but that doesn't mean that they're not getting ready for it. So this this pre-rut activity is going to continue through October, getting up into the end of October, right when it starts to become the actual rut. And during this time, at some point, the younger bucks are going to start to essentially pester the does. They're going to come up to them. They're going to try to be breeding with them, and the does will have nothing of it. The does at this point, they just want to eat right now. They're not going to worry about that. They're still trying to maintain that pattern. They want that food. They're preparing for winter. They're trying to add on fat. They're still protective of their fawns. Their fawns are hanging around with them. But, once again, we're getting ready to get into changes. When that rut starts changing everything and it hits, it really changes their patterns. Those does, they're still going to keep on eating, obviously. They're going to do the best they can to eat and trying to get their fawns to eat as well. But, at this time, you're running into the potential to where that your preferred foods are starting to run out. So that hot white oak tree, maybe one of the more preferred red oak trees, they are starting to, become exhausted. And so they start moving into a little lesser preferred acorns if they're available, or they'll find other foods. They'll keep on changing what their food is if they exhaust one. They're very versatile. And at this time, in that early part of November, they're going to be moving around a lot. One, for food, and two, because the rut is kicking in. And at that time, when that rut is kicking in, bucks begin to do what's referred to as cruising. They are traveling a lot. They will extend their range in cases. They might travel 2 to 4 miles outside of their home range, and they're searching for does and estrus. They're frequenting those areas where they might bed, where they're feeding at, the travel corridors, just trying to find does that are in estrus. And when they do, they will try to pin that doe. They will follow it around in the hopes that they can breed with it. They will chase them. It's not unusual to see a doe come trotting through the field with a line of bucks following behind it. I've seen times where, you have your big buck, your medium buck, your little medium buck, your little buck, and your little smaller buck, all in a train behind her, trying to get a chance to breed. And when the deer actually those does do actually allow them to breed, it's not always a one-time deal. It's not unusual for does to breed with multiple bucks. They're not as particular in terms of, always picking this one dominant buck. They will mate with multiple bucks. So, at this time though, the bucks, they're so single-minded focused on this breeding that a lot of times they are not eating a lot. And you can physically see a change in their appearance. One, their neck is swollen at this time. Just the testosterone in them causes their neck to swell, and then also the rubbing and the fighting and everything, their necks swell. They start to lose weight because they're going all the time. They're chasing deer. At times, they'll look exhausted. It almost looks like they're drunk. They're just so into, chasing does that they will do it to the detriment of their health. As I mentioned before, the does that don't breed at this time, they will come back into estrus in December, and you can end up with a second rut. And I want to touch on after the rut, you enter a post-rut territory. And pretty much at that point in time, it's all about food. From a hunting perspective, if you can find the food that they're using, then you are going to find deer. They are trying to replenish the lost nutrients that they had during the rut, especially the bucks. And you can see right here in this buck in particular, see how his rear hips are so narrow? That's not unusual to see with bucks after they've been through the rut. They will lose significant weight, and some of them become injured. They can lose their antlers early if they're in poor health, but those, they're usually in pretty dang good shape. They have not quit doing this feeding through it. They continue to eat during the rut, and they don't suffer this weight loss to near the extreme degree as the bucks will. And then after the season, the bucks are going to shed their antlers. They're going to move. Deer are going to move from food source to food source. And when one of them's exhausted or a newer, higher preferred food source becomes available, they're going to trigger on that food source. They're going to start to use their fat reserves, losing the weight. Then you're going to get into spring. You're going to start getting growth sprouting. It's going to green up, and that's when the buffet begins for them. They begin to pack on the weight again and get into the fawning season in April, May, June, where they will give birth to fawns about 200 days after they're bred. The bucks will begin to regrow their antlers in velvet, and then the cycle starts anew, so to speak. But kind of in conclusion, what I want to stress is, as hunters, you can't always assume that just because if we're setting up to bow hunt in September, that's not the same spot necessarily we want to gun hunt in November. The habitat and the environment that those deer are in play a large role in their movements, their patterns, and as those food sources change through the course of the year, they're going to change their patterns to adjust. And if you can learn those food sources, if you can learn the bedding areas, the areas that they rely upon, you can end up with a lot better chance of being successful as a hunter. And I mean, that's pretty much all I've got on that as far as prepared remarks.
That's awesome, Jason. We did have a question come in from Tabitha. Was wondering how you can tell a scrape versus just a worn spot in the earth. What are some signs that indicate that? So
let me pull up that slide again real quick. And the big thing that you'll see with a scrape is two things. You'll have the cleared out area right here, in which the deer will usually urinate in it. Then also above that scrape, you'll have what's called a licking branch. And you can see, I don't have a picture of both of them at the same time in it. But essentially, if you look at this deer right here with the scrape, this licking branch here on either one of these will be above it. And it will be, you'll be able to look at it and tell that it's been worn on. It won't look as pristine as the other sticks that are over the top of the scrape. And that's a chemical marker. It's very important. You don't want to actually touch the licking branch. And for that matter, if you can avoid stepping in a scrape or touching a scrape, that's a good idea, because you're leaving your scent in there at that point in time, and it could cause the deer to stop using that area or that particular scrape. But I wish I had a picture of both of them, but I don't have a picture of both of them. But that licking branch will be directly, like where my cursor is, right here, there's a licking branch above that scrape. And that's a dead giveaway for it. I hope that answers the question fairly well.
Yeah, and I think the picture of the scrape that you found on Sunday had some scat in it.
Yes, it did. Let me pull that up again real quick. Yeah, and this one, there was a licking branch. It was very indistinct because it still had leaves on the trees, but there was a licking branch there. But a lot of times you'll see hoof prints in them as well, where they actually drove their hoof through there. And, this is very early, but one way to tell, we're getting ready to have all the leaves fall off the trees, or at least the deciduous ones. And you'll have an area that's completely covered by leaves, and you'll have one spot directly under a licking branch that they've cleared every single leaf out of it. And it'll be usually moist and chewed up from their hooves.
I think that was pretty well covered. Easton did add that checking around the edge of fields, and then he mentioned the licking branches as well, or along roads through woods. That's where I've seen quite a few, is like off the side of a walking trail or a four-wheeler trail. A
logging road. Yes, that's it. Travel corridors, easy travel corridors. You'll see them along those a lot.
So we have a follow-up question. How often do bucks visit or check rubs?
It depends on the type of rub. You have some rubs that are, it's a one and done deal. They make it, and that is the last time they will ever see that rub. Then there is other areas that where occasionally they will revisit them, do a little bit of rubbing, but personally, I'm not, I've heard of people hunting rubs. To me, rubs are more of a sign that there has been deer in the area or bucks in the area, not so much as a consistent, a buck is going to return to this spot. Occasionally they will return to them, but I've never been much of a rub hunter, and have not heard of, for every person that, I guarantee you, if I say that you can't do it, I'll get plenty of people like, oh yeah, I've done it. But I've never seen enough of a pattern with them returning to rubs to where I'd rely on a rub as a place to necessarily hunt. More of
okay. And then I think April was just checking for clarification that they do return to scrapes more often than rubs, which I think is what you were just saying.
Right. And there's actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's two types of scrapes usually. There's the scrape that an individual buck will do with, and then they have communal scrapes where it's like everybody come join in, and they can get pretty dang big. I've seen scrapes that are 6 or 7 feet across versus a small scrape that probably one buck deals with.
And occasionally you can find scrapes and rubs and licking branches all together in one nice package.
Yes, I don't want to say that you won't see a rub. I've just not seen the consistency of returning to rubs to where I'd bank on just rubs. More of hey, there's a buck in the area type thing. One thing I would recommend everybody doing is having a journal to record what they see when they hunt. It helps a lot for spotting patterns and so on, especially, if you build up you start getting years of stuff, you can learn a lot from it. I forgot to mention that earlier.
Jason, I did have a question.
Okay.
Since you were mentioning, we saw the acorns from the oaks, and I was wondering if there is a trick to identify, while they still have the leaves on them, the red oak versus the white oak groups.
Yes, there is, and I wish I had a slide for that. Pretty much white oaks, they're going to have rounded lobes on their leaves. I'll pull the slide up and you can see it kind of on they're not on the tree, but these are white oak acorns right here. And it's not real easy to see. You can see a little better on this one, how the leaves are rounded on their lobes. If it was a red oak group, it would be more of a pointed one, more angular. That's the easiest way. Also, one thing that I haven't played around with it too much, I kind of learned how to identify trees the old-fashioned way. We didn't have apps when I did it. We had books that we used, but there's a lot of apps that you can download on your phone that you can take pictures of leaves and so on that will let you know. And it doesn't take that long to spot the patterns. But those rounded lobes are a giveaway for white oak group acorns. I
actually I use PlantNet. That's the Plant ID app that I have been using the most recently. There's quite a few others out there, and iNaturalist is another really good one. But just to give some people some ideas on what they could grab. And
I've had some good luck out of iNaturalist.
Yes, definitely. So David has a question. Can you determine what deer have been eating to narrow down where they are eating based on their scat?
I mean, yes, you can. I would go with the concentration that you see. If you see it concentrated in one area, you're probably either in a bedding or a feeding area. You might. It's more of one thing in a puzzle. It's one piece of the puzzle. If you see the scat, and then you see areas like around an oak tree where the leaves have been pulled away, that's definitely a good sign. Or if you see just, it's not necessarily the only factor that I'd put into it, but it's definitely a big factor. There's not an absolute 100% surefire way to know for sure that, yes, they were eating here as opposed to, no, he was just walking through. But it's definitely a piece of the puzzle.
Yes, and I'll just add that deer browse, once you have trained your eye to look for it, all of the vegetative browse will have this torn look to the tips instead of a clean cut. And that's because deer only have their bottom incisors and they just kind of rip. And so that is something you could look for. David, if you have follow-up questions there, just drop them in the chat for us. April was wondering, she said, I know baiting is a little controversial subject, but we hunt on private land with no oak trees. What just mainly soybeans, some corn, alfalfa, lots of water. Any suggestions to put out there to attract deer?
I mean, as far as baiting and everything, it's definitely legal on private land. You use lots of different things to bait, apples, corn, probably 99.9% of hunters use corn when they bait. But by that same token, the things that you mentioned, you also have a lot of food sources there that should be good through the year. Alfalfa is a year-long food if it's thick enough. Very high protein content, especially good early in the season. Soybeans, very good early season. Now they present challenges because a lot of times there's not necessarily the best areas to set up in a soybean field. There's just not a lot of good places to hide in a soybean field unless you have some trees along the edge. But if you want to experiment with baiting, yeah, you definitely can. Where I would caution with baiting is using it as a sole thing. Putting out a dump truck load of corn and expecting that to be your deer habitat. Baiting does not equal deer habitat, but it's a tool that's legal to use.
Steve was wondering, what about using doe urine or doe and estrus scent and I'm assuming, to attract the bucks? Do you have experience with that?
I have used it. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it. It obviously works to some degree. When something works out right, I'm usually kind of like, oh yeah, I did a good job of setting up for this. But then by that same token, when things don't work out for some reason, I always want to blame the deer urine, even though it probably had nothing to do with it. But yes, they're effective. They're not a cure-all. They're not the only thing. I'm not going to say if you put out deer urine, it's going to cure all of your hunting woes, but it's definitely, like I mentioned earlier, it's a piece of a puzzle. There's so many different ways to use it. I'm not really going to go into details with it, but there's so much information out there about deer urine and how to use it and everything. I've looked at some of those resources online and stuff, and but yes, I do use it occasionally. Sometimes it varies from year to year. Some years I'm convinced it works. Some years I can't stand it. But
I have a similar opinion as Jason. Steve, to be honest, some years, actually the first year I ever tried it, I thought, oh my gosh, this is the answer. We just had a great season, a great opening day, but I've never really had those results since then. And so kind of gotten away from using it at all. So I guess it's just, if you want to give it a try, give it a try. David did follow up and he said, to clarify, does the scat change in consistency based on what they eat? And so I'll let you go ahead.
I can say that yes, and I can also say I'm not qualified to diagnose that.
So if you don't mind, Jason, I'll just say you're going to see this more, David, during the seasons change. So in the summer, in the fall, early fall, when there's still a lot of green vegetation, there's still a lot of moisture in the vegetation. The scat definitely is like sticking together more. It's more green in color and it's more moist in general. And then as they change what their eating habits based on what's available to the hard mass, it's going to be those tight, dark pellets that might be the more picturesque when you picture deer scat. Okay. Rachel says, you mentioned south-facing hillsides in cold weather. Could you briefly explain the significance of thermal cover in extreme hot or cold?
So, obviously deer don't have houses like we do. So if we're outside and if it's beaming down 100 degrees outside, we're going to try to find a shade tree. Deer are the same way. If they can find a place to get in the shade, a little bit of a breeze blowing on them in the heat, they're gonna do it if possible. Likewise, that same thing when we get into the winter and if it gets brutal cold, if they can find a south-facing slope where that the sun is always going to be hitting on that south-facing slope once it gets high enough to where it clears any trees. It's just a little bit more of warmth that they can get out of it. And if there's just a little bit of cover, a depression, maybe cedar trees off to the side of them, something to block that wind, that's just a little bit more that's going to allow them to stay a little bit warmer. Deer, they're going to try to take advantage of every resource they have, and they're not going to waste energy if they don't need to. And if they can find an area that's a little warmer in the winter, they're going to do it.
Jason, thank you so much. Wow. Even I learned something. You had a great perspective, and I really appreciate you helping us out.